I'm Andy Garrett. I'm president of the RSS. A warm welcome to fellows and visitors to Errol Street, and also to those that are online today. We have a really nice group of people here and also online, so a substantial number of people who are really interested in this report, which is the independent review of the UK Statistics Authority by Professor Denise Lievesley. Denise has put an enormous amount of work into this over a year or so. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for doing all that, because it is a massive job. So thank you for doing all that work and for coming here today. In terms of the housekeeping rules, there's no fire alarm tests due today. So if the fire alarm does go out, it's probably a real fire, in which case out that way or out that way. And if you meet on the corner outside, there are a number of fire marshals around, so it should all go okay. For those who are online, please keep microphones muted and cameras turned off unless called to speak during the open session later. A recording of the meeting will be posted on the RSS YouTube channel. If anyone prefers not to be filmed, let us know and we can edit that part out. We actively encourage you to contribute to the discussion, whether you're online or whether you're here in person. However, it is a formal meeting, and so we do have a number of discussants, three eminent discussants, and a number of other people. So we're really looking forward to a lively discussion. You can use the chat box if you have any technical issues for those online. Comments will be written up afterwards, up to 400 words, and we published in the journal along with the paper. So moving on to the presentation from Denise of the independent review of the UK Stats Authority. The paper will be presented and will be published in the journal of the Royal Statistical Society Series A in 2024. A link to the original report will be provided, and the discussion will be based on the published review and the government's response to it. So I'd like to call upon Denise to present. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I must thank most everybody in this audience contributed in some way. So thank you all so much. So this was a regular review as part of the Cabinet Office Public Bodies Review Programme. And it was a review of the statistical system. So it was a review of the UK Statistics Authority, and therefore through that also covered the Office for National Statistics, the Office for Statistics Regulation, but also the broader Government Statistical Service, including the systems in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I was asked to address governance, efficacy, accountability and efficiency. It's important to say just a word about what this review isn't. It isn't a quality review of individual data outputs, and that's frustrating for some of you here today who wanted to talk to me about that. I found your feedback valuable, and I've been able to communicate that directly into the statistical system, even if it didn't feature in my report. But also it was helpful in terms of getting a pattern of systematic issues. And as a result of that, I proposed the appointment of a director of methodology in ONS, as I think methodology needs more attention. I also cautioned against the defensive attitude some users experience when they raise concerns about quality. My review highlighted the difficulties of getting the balance right between humility and confidence in statistical releases. The UKSA is already committed to achieving efficiencies in the spending review, so the Cabinet Office steered me firmly away from making suggestions for further efficiencies and from commenting on the appropriateness of the budget. A bit frustrating at times, that last one. I sat on the shoulders of giants by building on the previous reviews, particularly that by Sir Charles Bean on economic statistics and by Andy Garrett on methodology. I was very pleased with the engagement I had with PACAC, where the chair at the time and the secretary really welcomed my views and listened to me. Let me pull out a few of the themes of the review. I want to begin with international reputation. The international reputation of the UK statistical system is high, particularly as a result of the UK's boldness in collecting data quickly during COVID. The infection survey was used by many other countries. We know the data aren't perfect, and we've been able to reflect since then on what could have been done better. But everyone I spoke to from other statistical officers across the world said we led the way. The Office for Statistics Regulation has a growing interest and reputation internationally and is increasingly seen as one of the jewels in our crown. Of course, internationally, there are some negative attitudes too. The decentralisation of our system with departments collecting some of the key data and the separation of the 4 administrations of the UK collecting their own data is seen as leading to inconsistencies and fragmentation. I would, however, point out that even countries that have apparently centralised systems are not always as focused as they might appear. So, for example, during COVID, we learnt that in Canada, the statistical system is a federated system, but health is delegated to the provinces. And there was difficulty in terms of getting access by the Central Statistical System, Statistics Canada, to health data. And they said they used UK data. There's also concern, and I shared this concern, about our loss of engagement in Eurostat. Worries that our influence over cross-national standards and methodologies will, as a result, be diminished. The second big issue that I addressed was the independence of the profession. How do we ensure the right balance between independence and relevance? A forthcoming report of the US system, which I've had the pleasure to referee, speaks of protecting professional autonomy. I really like that term. I think it's a good term. Statisticians inside and outside government need to be free to publish statistics, even when they're uncomfortable to the government of the day. And that's so critical to trust in data. We've made some good progress over recent years. Statistics are released on predetermined dates and times to ensure that they're not buried. Prior access is severely restricted, and data is produced with impartial interpretation by the statisticians. However, I identified 2 major issues. The first is that these internationally agreed standards for the protection of the integrity of data are not universally applied across the whole of the GSS. And I recommended that this should change. But you'll probably know that that recommendation was rejected by the government. I hope that the governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will reconsider that. The second major issue is there is a lack of transparency over what is collected. Statistics are a public good, as Paul Allen has been pioneering through the RSS. They grow in value the more they're used. And of course, we want to ensure that we have statistics that are needed to inform policy decisions, but we also need to know that we have the data to call our public institutions to account. But users, both those inside and outside government, felt that they didn't know enough about how the statistical agenda was set. And there was suspicion that it was set too much according to government's needs. Also, the funding of the system at the moment means that the programme of data collection can be potentially distorted by government departments paying for additional data collection or analysis. That's hard to get right. We want a statistical system which is agile and responsive, but the opportunity costs are high when we can't easily expand the statistical expertise available within government. And a number of concerns were expressed to me about resources being moved from regular data collection, which is sometimes seen as boring, but unfortunately is really, really critical and important, to exciting new projects, especially if they bring in more funding. So what do we do about setting the statistical agenda? So I've proposed a triennial statistical assembly, bringing together the broad community of statistics users inside and outside government in order to map data needs. This requires a really responsible and constructive attitude from those of us who are users of the statistics. The RSS has a really important role here to ensure that it doesn't become a whinge fest and that users are respectful of the fact that there are limited resources and competing priorities. I'd like to see the UKSA having a higher profile, beginning with this transparent process, getting involved in this mapping exercise, and then more openly than is currently the case, setting the agenda for statistics. The Assembly has the potential to help too with the consultation and coherence of UK-wide data. And I'm interested to hear from David Hand about how he sees the committees that currently exist, the specialist committees, feeding into this process, because I think they're really critical. So my next topic is really about the sources of data, and it won't be a surprise that there's agreement across all OECD countries that in future more statistics will be produced based on administrative systems, sometimes in combination with survey data. I don't need to, with this audience, to rehearse the reasons why, response burden, possibility of more timely data, perhaps a reduction in the long-term cost. So I think that can be exaggerated in the immediate future. But of course, a big driver is the falling response rates. These are falling globally, really severe in the UK. And the need to develop the methodologies, the technologies, the community to share administrative data has led to the development of the Integrated Data Service. It's a really critical programme, providing opportunities for linking data across areas. And that enables us to recognise that many issues we address are cross-sectoral. Health is related to housing, is related to employment, etc. However, there is a lack of clarity with respect to the development of the IDS. And academics in particular were asking whether it would replace the secure research services. And many of them were worried about the apparent slowness of including new data. I think people inside the system as well as outside the system were worried about the slowness. And it led me to highlight the attention that needs to be paid to the commitment to data sharing across government departments. It is my view that this is largely a problem of culture and that we've not paid enough attention to positive incentives for data sharing and for good examples of why we need to share data. Often the legislation is blamed, but actually the legislation in the main, there are exceptions. Health data, I think, is particularly problematic, but in the main, the legislation is quite permissive. But the owners of the admin data sources feel that they carry all of the responsibilities and blame if things go wrong. So incentives are really critical. I'm sure that'll be a topic of discussion. My next topic I wanted to highlight was skills development. How do our public services develop the data science skills needed for ensuring we have quality statistical work in the future? Promotion in the civil service too often focused on management expertise rather than technical expertise. We don't pay specialist civil servants enough to compete with the private sector. Incidentally, this is an international problem, but we can learn from other national statistics agencies. Some of them have more porous boundaries with academia and the private sector, in some cases joint appointments. In some cases, they're giving more autonomy and greater interesting technical work to civil servants. So I think it is an issue we should be discussing internationally. The Data Science Campus was set up as a result of the Charlie Bean review, in part to address this whole issue. And I'm very happy with the role it's playing across government to raise data skills. But I would have liked to have found more examples of ways in which it's directly impacted the work of the ONS. A related issue that I discussed is the talent pipeline for senior positions, particularly that of the national statistician. It requires such a wide range of expertise and skills to manage a large delivery unit, as well as leading the profession, as well as engaging with the government and political systems. But I also questioned the status of some of the heads of profession in the government statistical service, including the devolved administrations. Some of these statisticians are navigating complex, high profile and politically sensitive areas of work, but they're not at a high enough grade to have the power and influence that they really need. I changed my mind about a few things. I guess the key one is the fact that ONS, production arm, and OSR, regulation arm, both report to UKSA. And I know some of you feel very strongly about this. It's an unusual configuration, and it has led some of us to worry about coziness in the system. However, I had the privilege of attending the separate committee for regulation, which is chaired by Penny Young, and which the National Statistician does not attend. And I was really impressed by the robust discussions. I'm also assured that the Director for Regulation is a separate accounting officer. He reports to Sir Robert, and he goes in his own right to PACAC and select committees. Would I have designed it this way, with the two of them reporting to the same board? No, and I said that at the time. I was one of the people in the RSS fighting that that wasn't the right structure. But would I change it now? No, I wouldn't. I think the disruption would be too great at a critical time for statistics. And I was also persuaded by board members of UKSA that their ability to look across both ONS and the OSR is critical. But the Statistics Act needs to be updated to reflect this practice, or we're vulnerable when personnel change. Finally, I want to highlight the difficult tightrope walked by official statisticians. They need to innovate, or their statistics will be seen as inferior to other organisations, which are sometimes technically much more advanced. Chris Giles's blog on price data yesterday, called Measurement Matters, really interesting on this topic. And Anil Arora, who until the end of March was the head of Statistics Canada, gave a fascinating paper on this topic at last year's World Statistics Forum in Ottawa. So innovation is really important, but they can't run faster than their collaborators and users. Although the census was out of scope for my review because there's a separate consultation about it, a number of local government statisticians expressed their worry about the fragility of their admin records and the fact that they need a census to triangulate the quality of their admin data. Also, the statisticians in Wales and Northern Ireland impressed on me that there's data which they need, which simply isn't available from current administrative records. I was extremely honoured to conduct this review, and I'm grateful to so many official statisticians in the UK and beyond for their frankness, and to many others who care about the quality and availability of data enough to spend time with me. So Robert asked me at one point whether it was fun. I think we were having lunch at the time. That was quite fun. It wasn't always. Because I think one of the difficult things was how you encourage change where it's needed, but not to undermine a system where I know people are working hard, battling legacy systems, and in an environment where statistical expertise isn't always valued. So it was a significant responsibility. I would say that one thing that is fun is it's nice not to be thrown on the rubbish heap when you retire. If.
Denise, that was excellent. And you know, one thing that strikes me, just to say very quickly, is that just how thorough that review was and the breadth of what was discussed. I mean, it makes an excellent discussion paper because of that depth and breadth and thoroughness. So with that, I'm now going to open it up for the formal lead discussants to come along. So I'm going to call upon Sir Robert Choate, who is the chair of the UK Statistics Authority. So Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about this fantastic review. I only asked the "Are you having fun?" question once, which is obviously too small a sample to get a full sense of what the whole exercise might have been like. As you say, it was a very nice lunch. I very much welcomed the fact that this review was taking place. I think it's enormously important for public bodies of this sort to occasionally have a critical friend looking from outside and thinking about what you're trying to achieve, how you're going about that, the context and the environment in which you're trying to do that, and to offer constructive suggestions. When I used to run the Office for Budget Responsibility, the forecasting model, we pioneered an OECD-wide process for peer review combined with expert review, and went through that a couple of times, and it was hugely valuable. Often valuable for asking the question that Denise wasn't allowed to ask, is, do you have enough money to do the job that you have been given? But that one has necessarily been left to one side. All public bodies are being covered by these, but I think the importance of covering the authority end of the statistical system more broadly is because it is, as somebody that Denise and I were talking about her review at another audience last night, described as a part of the critical national infrastructure, a robust, well-funded, well-resourced, appropriately foundationed in terms of legislation, rights and responsibilities is absolutely key to ensuring that we as citizens, academia, understand society and the economy and its evolution, and of course that this informs policy debate and policy formation. As Denise said, getting the balance between those two is not straightforward. The society rightly picked up what I think was probably infelicitously bad drafting of the Cabinet Office, saying that essentially the point of the thing is to serve government. It's not, it's to serve society as a whole. More often than not, the demands of government and broader society are not necessarily inconsistent. One shouldn't assume it's always a zero-sum game in that, but clearly that broader perspective, it was hugely valuable of the society to pick up on that. In terms of touching on some of the themes that Denise has raised, I'll be necessarily slightly less definitive than I would ideally be, on the grounds that the board is considering its formal response to the review next week, and that process is ongoing. But you won't be astonished to hear me say that there's very little in here that we would be seeking to push back against. It's all hugely constructive input. And as I said before I came into this role, the one recommendation which wasn't accepted around pre-release access is one that I would warmly welcome and agree with anyway. I think it's an Denise has mentioned some of the context in which this review has been taking place, and I think it would be fair to say that at the beginning of it, the system was in a sense coming off what you described as being a sort of well-received, not universally well-received, rising to the challenge of COVID. and it's moved as the review was going on into a period when there were more challenges surfacing across different parts of the system and different parts of its output. So I think it's important to recognise that and some of those background challenges. I think the background to the whole review and to the whole system at the moment is a much greater awareness within and outside government of the value of the insight that good use of data and good use of statistics can bring, and that means more demand as well. But at the same time, that across the rest of the public service and not just this part, resources are constrained, inflation and pay pressures are high, and there are particular challenges in terms of the ability to maintain quality, as Denise described, around the falling response rates to household surveys, which make it more expensive essentially to maintain the quality of the outputs that you would be getting from those. Hence, in part, the greater emphasis on the ability to use administrative data to supplement that, to replace that in some cases, but also raising some other issues which Denise did raise but didn't make a definitive recommendation, for example, the mandation of responses to things like the labour force survey, and I look forward to some Australian perspective on that while we're here, in terms of again, different countries taking different approaches to how you address that issue. I can't go through all of the 19 recommendations that Denise ended up with, but let me pick up a few of the areas of interest. One around the sort of the governance and legislation, where I was naturally very pleased and delighted that Denise got to see how the governance of the ONS and OSR within the UXA umbrella works in practice. I would be the first to admit, and I said before I was in this role, that with a blank sheet of paper, would you necessarily have designed this? It was designed quite some time ago, of roughly the same vintage as the BBC Trust, which brought in both regulation and production under a similar umbrella, or under the same umbrella, with not particularly happy results in that area. But I was pleased that Denise concluded that it's working and that there's no need to fix what isn't broken in that sense. And I certainly see it very much as my responsibility, as the chair of the authority, to treat the national statistician and the head of the OSR as being, as it were, dual chief executives of their own areas of responsibility. If it comes to it, I have said to both of them, I side with the regulator when there's a row between the two of them, and a key advantage of spanning the system is that if there were any occasion, and not that there has been, that the ONS were trying to give the OSR a runaround in terms of the way that it's trying to exercise its regulatory function, I would be able to prevent that. And I think the difficulty would come if you had the OSR as being a small, isolated entity trying to regulate a much larger one. And you can come to a similar argument with the BBC example of the fact that people have variously suggested creating an OFBB, which would try to regulate the whole BBC. Actually moving it to a larger body like Ofcom to do that makes more sense. There's no equivalent alternative there. And so I think that while, as I say, you look at it drawn on a piece of paper and think this looks a bit odd, I'm not sure in practice I can think of a system that would work better in terms of engaging that regulatory function. And I was very pleased as Ed and those working in OSR were to hear the high regard in which OSR, I think it's fair to say, is held internationally, but also in its relationships with the statisticians working in individual government departments, where OSR is seen as strengthening their hand, helping to promote good behaviour, for example, around intelligent transparency, rather than causing more problems than it concludes. And so that was quite a welcome finding. Of the other areas, I think data sharing, rightly identified as a very important part of the review and a desirable component of the success of the integrated data service. Potentially the success or the potential to move to a more administrative data-based census. that data sharing has to work. And Denise, I think, rightly identified that there is, with the best will in the world, a limit to what the ONS and the UKSA can do without the levers to pull to change those sorts of cultural and other barriers in the way in which departments are or are not willing to share data. There are other things for which the ONS, is responsible to help make that a success, and I don't shy away from that at all. And there needs to be further progress in that area as well. But this idea of partly asking the centre of government to take a greater responsibility for addressing the collective action problem, if you like to think of it that way, of the benefits of data sharing being relatively widely spread and diffuse, and the risks of something going wrong being rather concentrated. That's important. The discussion we had last night, I think also, if you're in a situation where you can identify more successful use cases where 3 departments, for example, have real value to themselves of the sharing of data between them, that can operate as a virtuous circle. People can see why it's worthwhile. There will be greater keenness for other people to engage that, less reluctance to do so. So I think that's a very valuable potential area. In terms of the Assembly, I think this is a very welcome initiative in terms of providing another basis on which to consider the strategic challenges facing the system and to crowdsource wisdom across the community of producers and users in terms of where the statistical system should be going, both in terms of scope and the how of that. And we're hugely grateful to you, Andy, Sarah, and to the RSS for partnering with us and thinking about how we might be able to take this forward, because I think not only because of the great input you would bring substantively, but it's also important that this isn't seen as a cosy exercise for the system itself. And so having that independent partnership, I think, will be hugely valuable. As Denise would be the first to admit, there is no off-the-shelf model for this anywhere else that we can go and say, oh, it's worked fine there, let's tweak a few bits and give it a try. So it'll be a suck it and see to start with. We'll have to try it one way to begin with, then to go into that with best will, see what we come out of it, and then talk to stakeholders about whether they think that's the right way to proceed and to do things again in future. Denise has mentioned a couple of the challenges, one of which is obviously to try to have something that has breadth of engagement and involvement from people right across the system, but at the end to be able to distill that down into some news you can use. And that's not a straightforward process, and I think that the David Hans committee will be helpful along with other colleagues in trying to sort of get from what we hope can be a wide and positive process to something where we can identify a few priorities and key themes to come out of that. I'm sure there will be lots of people who will perfectly reasonably see this as an opportunity to argue for the things that they've argued for in other fora many times, and there's no problem with that at all. We do, though, have to recognise that there is a resource constraint here. The other thing to recognise, I think, is that we are looking across the system as a whole. And so for the authority to take away the conclusions of this and try to act on them and draw upon them, we all know that the majority of official statistics are not produced by the ONS. They're produced elsewhere in the official system, and you might be producing recommendations on what you need to be doing in health, social care, crime, etc., that are not primarily the responsibility of the ONS. And it will be as much about informing the decisions that other government departments and public bodies as well as ONS are making about resource allocation and about what they should be asking for in their negotiations with the Treasury. But let us not kid ourselves. I looked at Twitter, I think, just before I came in. There's lots of election speculation. We could be off to the races sooner than we might all have imagined when we woke up this morning. Whatever the outcome of that, we're not going to be in a magic world where there's going to be money sloshing around the public services system, and it'll be the same for the official statistical system in its various components as well. So again, behind all of this, there needs to be a realism about resource availability and prioritization. If we think this is really important, what are the things that we think actually we could do less of or differently, etc. As I say, could go on with many of these. Maybe I should mention the UK-wide comparability question, which I think is a very interesting one, and Denise rightly points out the value of having coherence and comparability, where you can have it in order to increase public all of our understanding of how particular public services, for example, are working, and also to feed into government policy. But one has to recognise that the point of devolution is to allow devolved administrations to do things in different ways. And if you're trying to run a policy or a health system or an education system in a different way, you may be collecting different sorts of administrative or other informative data in order to do that. And if you come in from outside and say, well, it would be wonderful if you did it the same way, or you all did it this way, that imposes a resource cost on them. And I think you need to build on what I think is a genuine sense and willingness to cooperate, to build on that. Then you're going to need to think about the resourcing of people doing things in a way that they don't necessarily need to do it just for their own purposes, but for the broader good. And that also, I think, comes to broader issues around the use of administrative data and some of the concerns you hear about how much reliance can we really put on this when it's designed for the purposes of running a system rather than having necessarily the aims of the statistical outputs that have broader benefits. There's got to be cost sharing issues there. If you want the data to be collected in a way that is serving two purposes, you may have to think about the way in which that is funded and resourced. So there's much else we can go into. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of discussion. So let me leave it largely there, other than to say thank you very much indeed again to Denise for the input into this, and for all the many people here and elsewhere who have fed into this. I think it's been a hugely useful and informative exercise, and I hope that we can get good value out of it. As I say, there are various elements of this that will be ongoing debates over time. This is not something we learn from once. It's something I'm sure that we will come back to and learn from in the future. So thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Rob. And I know that you said that's not the official UK Stats Authority viewpoint because of the board meeting, but it was just so great to have the context and you speaking about the review. So thank you very much for that. So we now move on to Rebecca Riley, who's director of the UK Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence. Slides. Great.
Thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me to discuss the independent review of the UK Statistics Authority. Let me start by congratulating Denise Lievesley for her work in pulling together this review, putting forward many very constructive recommendations. And I think, given the breadth of the issues and a very complex stakeholder landscape, this is really no mean accomplishment. The review articulates 19 recommendations, many of which I and colleagues of mine working on economic statistics welcome, including the suggestions to improve harmonization of data and statistics across the 4 nations of the UK, and also to ensure that there is a better understanding of the levels of uncertainty around economic statistics in particular, to reduce public and government surprise to revisions. But I want to pick up on 2 key themes in the review, key at least as I see it, and from the perspective of engagement between the statistical system and academia. And the first of these is around the importance of facilitating data sharing, and the second will be around resourcing the development of statistics, economic statistics in particular. So on the first of these, the review highlights complex barriers to data sharing across government and with academia, and recommends high-level national leadership in order to resolve this, not just for the benefit of developing and producing statistics, but more widely. And I have to say, I couldn't agree more, both on the diagnosis and also on the proposed way forward. We've seen highlighted before the importance of data sharing, for example, for the development of economic statistics. For one, with the Bean Review in 2016, that's 8 years ago. We've had a Digital Economy Act in 2017, a legal mechanism which paved the way for data sharing in the UK for the purposes of statistics development and research. COVID-19, creating a situation of national emergency, advanced data sharing across government as well. And there have, of course, been many pockets of investment in data sharing infrastructure like ADR UK. Nevertheless, there is, I think, a wide sense, and certainly in academia, that progress on this front has been slow. In some cases, some might say data sharing has even taken a step backwards. And this is really important because it means opportunities lost. To give you a little example in terms of opportunities lost from where I'm standing, from my world, academic colleagues may sometimes, rightfully, dissuade their PhD students from studying UK issues, i.e. using UK data, because of the difficulties in getting access to data and uncertainties around whether they're going to be able to continue to access them for the length of their PhD, for example. So instead, these students may then focus their attention on issues elsewhere. So that's clearly not ideal from the perspective of the UK. And as the review highlights, barriers to data sharing are very much multifaceted, including misalignment of incentives and priorities and fragmentation of the statistical system. So the need for high-level leadership to cut through this seems pretty clear. And from the point of view that data is critical infrastructure supported by the statistical system, but also going beyond it, I hope that Denise Lievesley's recommendations on this front are embraced by government and of course by all of us, so that this time is different and we won't be raising the same issues 10 years on again. And I would also remind those taking these issues forward of the untapped potential in academia and the importance of engaging there. The second set of issues that I want to discuss are around resourcing. And, I'm very much aware that Denise Lievesley's review's remit was not to focus directly on resourcing issues and budgets, etc. Nonetheless, I think the review raises a number of issues which are likely to be important for resourcing the statistical system, particularly at a time of pressed public funds. One is this proposed statistical assembly. Now, whilst I imagine it will be less than straightforward to operationalize effectively, the wider engagement that this proposes between stakeholders might provide a useful coordinating mechanism through which to improve resource allocation, both within the statistical system and crowding in complementary investment, supporting a sustained focus on agreed big issues. And the importance of a sustained focus and investment in developing high quality statistics for decision making should not be underestimated. Just as an example from another review, many of us have seen the importance of the sustained focus facilitated by the Bean Review. Amongst many other things, the Bean Review lamented the lack of a new generation amongst the economics profession paying attention to research and development in economic statistics. Building that new generation requires an environment of consistent and sustained focus. And off the back of that review, we've seen some very bright young people engage with issues of economic measurement. And they didn't have to do that, but they did do that because the conditions were there. So I hope that the proposed statistical assembly will play a role in sustaining investment and longer-term focus for the statistical agenda, also in this way supporting the development of necessary human capital. And a related topic of human resources touched upon in Denise Lievesley's review are the constraints imposed by the human capital model under which the statistical system operates. The review points to the need to find a better approach to rewarding technical and scientific experts. And I do hope this will be picked up on. As an example from economic statistics, in any case, we need a human capital model that doesn't necessarily reward rotating through many different management roles, but which allows people to build the technical skills required and progress in their careers with those skills. And collaboration between the statistical system and academia can, of course, support this. So to summarize, I think this review gets across a breadth of important issues for the statistical system. And from the perspective of academic collaboration with it, key pointers that I take away from the review are the need for high-level leadership around data sharing and developing the conditions for investment, human capital, and otherwise. Thanks for your attention. I'd like to conclude by thanking Denise Lievesley for her excellent work and a helpful set of recommendations.
Every age believes it lives in a time of unprecedented change. And I was rather amused to read recently that when challenged by the United States President Johnson, I believe it was in the mid-60s, to devise scientific methods to forecast the future, the Commission concluded that one of the reasons why historic forecasts from the 1920s, say, because in the 1930s and 40s people were rather more involved with surviving than forecasting the future. The reason why these historic forecasts had been wrong had been that they did not have data on demographic and social trends available to them. But now, in the 1960s, people were devising these scientific and statistical methods of measuring social trends. And so the future for research was, for forecasting, was looking very rosy. Of course, if we were sitting in their position now, we'd say, what do we not have now? And I suppose it's information about behaviour, isn't it? And people's attitudes. Anyway, so from that basis, and they developed all sorts of think tank concepts and whatever. So it's proved that the production of statistics has been pretty rosy, but it seems that we're now at the point where those post-war scientific methods are no longer working so well, and we have to innovate to protect the quality of our national statistics. So I too welcome Professor Lievesley's report, and I know she's worked very hard on it. And also, of course, the Bean Review and Andy Garrett's methodology review from 2016, all of which point in a similar direction, I believe, and hopefully we can take it forward. So I personally am bringing a commercial view, an external view, if you like. And I just want to comment really on 3 of the recommendations. This is always the problem of being last, isn't it? You're afraid that everybody's already mentioned what you're going to say. I think it's probably true, but hopefully I'm bringing a slightly different perspective. Recommendation 1, I think we can make very good use of the triangular agenda, though I'm already hearing some different views as to how it should be done, as an opportunity to drive long-term development. Recommendation 2, which is the Director General of Methodology. I'm a proud methodologist myself, and I welcome a renewed focus on methodology and training. And recommendation 14, which was to the LFS, think about making the LFS mandatory, therefore working on response rates. I think those are very key points, and those are the 3 I'm going to focus on. So recommendation 1, the Triennial Statistical Assembly. A 3-year plan is a real chance to rationalise the heavy workload. It's already been referred to. Trying to collect far too many statistics, outdated methodologies are making the workload even heavier, and we need to focus on getting the key statistics right. And there's a real opportunity with a 3-year plan to innovate and develop new methodologies, and not, as we tend to do, tinker with the older ones which are no longer fit for purpose. And I would point out Andy Garrett's first recommendation from his review, which was place innovation at the heart of a new core methodology identity. I think that's a very sound objective for those assemblies. And for user engagement, obviously youth are important, but let's not give way, as it were, to lobby groups of minority interests, but focus on the really important statistics for the economy and employment and inflation, things that we need to do. And also, as the RSS is several times already mentioned, take the opportunity for more partnership outside of government, especially for non-priority statistics. The private sector, the commercial sector, if you like, that produces an awful lot of statistics, which I personally have found government not always likely to take in. And I think that more could be done to use external commercial sources to deliver statistics that are not of perhaps the key national interest. So now to my favourite subject of all time, methodology. And Denise recommended a Director General who would foster engagement with senior methodologists and other national statistical offices and in academia, and hopefully also the commercial sector. We need to focus on methodology, new innovative methods, and promotion of the importance of the role. And again, Andy made this point in 2016. I note that the current director of the US Census Bureau has over 40 years of experience of survey research, less than me, statistical design and analysis. And somehow there is this image problem. I was talking to Rory Sutherland yesterday. I'm not name checking or anything. It's the only time I have ever talked to him. But one of his favourite sayings is that weed is simply a flower without a PR budget, which I always tell my weeds as I'm pulling them up. And maybe methodologists can be heroes without a PR budget or something similar. Anyway, you can tell from that that's why I'm a methodologist and not an advertising person. But here we go. Focus on training, training and training. It's always been difficult to recruit people into our stats departments, but it's getting difficult, and retention is almost impossible. And this is an area where experience really matters. You know, it isn't something that can be automated or whatever. You need to have been through it and seen it all before. So Denise mentioned the group that you've set up, but could we not develop an academy to train young statisticians and have better career development plans? The ONS, RSS, MRS, and any number of three-letter acronyms ending in S, and the major survey companies like NatSen, Jerry and I have talked about this, could develop together maybe a graduate apprenticeship scheme, so bringing them in a little bit earlier in survey statistics to attract young talent, mentor them, and give them a wider experience to ensure that they stay in the role. I mean, they need to believe that they can get to the top. Surveys are becoming more complex, all these things, but in the 80s we were doing studies with most of those things. I've never actually tried to involve biomeasures in any of my surveys, I must admit, but certainly all the others existed then. But we always had better response rates, which always makes things easier. I mean, we used to get 80, 90% response rates in the 80s. I mean, it's unbelievable. Now, people just can't credit it. And the trouble is that the more this comes in, the more biases there are, the more we have to wait, the more the poor old statisticians are in there at the rock face, working hard on slightly boring things. There's no chance for innovation and learning. There's no career development path. Apparently better jobs are available elsewhere. They call themselves data scientists. There's a bit of new branding. And they move on quickly. We shouldn't be surprised. And your recommendation number 4 was introduce a technical career ladder, and Denise has already mentioned it. They've got to believe that they can get to the top. I won't put forward Jerry Nicholas there and myself as examples, but we did it, didn't we? You know, and people have to believe that they can move on with these skills and actually run companies and have really senior and important jobs. You know, the commercial sector is quite willing to help with that. So last but not least, and everybody's mentioned response rates, really got to focus on this, whether mandatory is a good idea or not. Certainly we've got to do something about it. The recent LFS write-up says initially low response rates, subsequent high attrition rates, particularly amongst young people of large households. And there you are, alarm bells, large households, ethnic minorities, bias. No amount of imputation, weighting or modelling or whatever is going to help you correct those biases. So I hesitate to suggest yet another working group, but let's compile everything that everybody's done over the last few years. A lot has been done over the last 10 years, looking at different incentives and nudge to knock or knock to nudge or nudge to telephone or whatever all these things are called. There's been a lot done on response rates, let's compile all of that at least and be sure that there isn't a simpler way of getting a better response rates than going mandatory, because it's not very British, is it, being mandatory? So basically, this is the end of B. Use the 3-year plan to prioritise, innovate, offload and communicate clearly. Focus on recruitment, training and retaining methodologies, and identify ways to improve response rates on the surveys that really matter. And I apologise if I've repeated what other people have said, but to me, these are the really key things that that we do need to focus on. And thanks to everybody who's done all the hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. You certainly didn't duplicate what everyone else said. You certainly didn't duplicate what everyone else said. So that was some really nice, unique insights there. So thank you for that. So we now move on to more of an open session. So thanks, first of all, thanks to everybody who's presented so far. The next session, we move on to essentially a 5-minute maximum contribution each. We have 6 people currently on the list to present. But this is also an opportunity for you to start sort of thinking about raising your hand, and that includes electronically on the system as well. So I did fail technically last time round. I'll probably fail again this time round. But our first discussant in the 5-minute slot is Tony Dent from Better Statistics, and he is joining online. And I think, Tony, you're able to share your slides. Is that right?
We have the slides.
Do we have the slides?
You're currently muted, Tony.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, I've got to find my slides now. Dear, oh dear.
Just
And,
do it.
I didn't expect to be first, Andrew, but thank you very much. Let me try to find.
Let me see if we have. We do have some slides here for you. So,
well, they're very brief.
I think these.
Phyllis has spoken. My colleagues and I, as directors of Better Statistics, decided that we probably disagreed on so many things that we'd better not put forward our own ideas on Professor Lievesley's report. So we thought we'd ask other people what they thought. So we conducted this survey, which is the first chart. I don't know if you've got that one up. Have you?
Trying at the moment.
Yes, that's the first
There you
part.
are.
Is that sharing?
Yes, a summary of the preliminary results from a survey that we put up. And we've invited lots and lots and lots of people, something like 400 or 500 to repeat, and just 45 bothered to start it. If we move on to the next chart, so I want to tell you the summary of the opinions we've got so far.
Okay. Is that okay?
Can you move on to the next chart?
The next, can you see technical note?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there. Yes, 45. The technical note was that we asked everybody, we actually reported precisely what Professor Lievesley had said, and we asked for the comments whether they agreed or disagreed. And then we actually did say, and this is what the Cabinet Office says about it. What are your comments about that? 45 people started the survey, but only a very, very few gave any reasons for their responses. Possibly respondents didn't believe us that they would be entirely anonymous. So can we move on? Now, the main findings was that eventually only 16 persons went through all 19 and gave an overall opinion. And they, in general, supported everything. Just 2 people said they weren't in support. But the most important thing of all was that on each of the 19 people, if we move to the next chart, each of the 19 recommendations, there was disagreement on every one. And on balance, 11 of them, there was a favourable balance. 6 were neutral at the end of the day, and 2 were considered unfavourable. But I think looking at the data in detail, which we're not doing here, it just goes to show exactly how difficult this task was for Professor Lievesley, to see the variety on each one of the recommendations. Indeed, I don't think there was any case of, there was only one case where so far that there hasn't been a strongly disagreed, even if a number of people did agree. There was one case, but there still were people who disagreed. So that, in fact, when I say 11 favourable on balance, the average was less than agree, because if you took the disagrees away from it, the balance was less than I agree, even on the 11 favourable ones. 6 were actually just balance, either the disagreement and the agreement was absolutely balanced, and 2 end up not balanced. So there's an awful lot of controversy in our business. So if we finally, clearly more evidence is needed. Only 20 people provided opinions on all of the 19 recommendations. And all I do is plead open. The survey remains open for completion. I think our assessors said around the link, and here it is again. If you were completing it and you stopped, if you go back to the same link, it should pick you up exactly where you were and you can finish, so that perhaps the 45 will complete the whole thing. And please do give your comments, although I have to say, doing the analysis of the comments, which I've been starting to do, it's really, there isn't an awful, there are a few ideas there, which somebody like Mr. Choate may be interested in conveying, but the survey so far is not providing what I had hoped it might provide, which is a clear indication of what it is that people are really interested in. Yes, of course, the triennial thing is of interest and has, on balance, that's one of the most interesting, but surprisingly enough, there are a number of people who entirely disagree with it. So there you are. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tony. We're now going to move on to Dennis Trewin. I don't believe you have any slides. No.
Well, thank you very much.
Sorry, former national statistician in Australia.
Yes, and at one stage I was also director of methodology, which is relevant to tonight's discussion. First, I'd like to congratulate Denise on an excellent, insightful and a very easy to read report. I'm only going to speak on 2 recommendations, and it's a bit of overlap with Phyllis, but we're not going to be disagreeing, I don't think. So I'm going to speak about the second recommendation, which was for a Director General methodology, and I'm also going to speak about labour force survey response rates, which are relevant to recommendation 14. Some of the most trusted statistical officers worldwide, such as Canada and Australia, have had very senior directors of methodology who have also been members of the executive, often at the Deputy National Statistician level. And I would strongly support the recommendation, but I would provide the recommendation for the Director General Methodology with even more functional responsibility than what's suggested in the review. When I first held a senior methodology position in the mid-1970s, the responsibilities were essentially design analysis of sample surveys, adjustment, and design of quality management schemes. Interest in non-sampling errors and the impact on design analysis was at its infancy. Methodology is much more complex now. Sources are broader, include administrative data and big data, perhaps in combination with sample surveys. The quality characteristics of the data sources are very different, and sample surveys also are becoming more challenging. Modelling is becoming an increasingly important skill of methodologists. Cohesion across data sources is also much more important. It's not just about using consistent statistical standards. Inconsistent design decisions can also lead to a lack of cohesion. In Australia in the early 1990s, the national accounts were not behaving well, with a lot of criticism from key users. Investigations showed that the main reason was actually inconsistent design decisions across the different data sources, including the use of inconsistent frames and different treatments for non-response. It is for these types of reasons that I think the scope of the work of the Director General methodology should be broader than suggested in the review. To have true influence, They should be at a more senior level at ONS. And I would also suggest that be represented on the board of the UK Statistics Authority, as they can have a beneficial influence throughout the UK statistical system. Phyllis noted that the current head of the US Census Bureau was long-term methodologist. Before him, and there's a few others in between, Bob Groves was also director of methodology at the Census Bureau and became the overall director. Alvin Felligy is an example of Canada, whose career was through methodology and became a very effective chief statistician. And in Australia, both Bill McLean and myself went from being methodologists to head of the statistical service. So just a few comments on the labour force survey response rates. The recommendation in the report was that falling response rates to surveys are having a detrimental effect on the quality of outputs, most notably on the labour force survey. One potential mitigation is to mandate responses, as some other countries do, such as Australia. The possibility of mandating responses for some key surveys should be explored in the UK, and the report that this recommendation has actually been accepted. Response rates for national statistical officers have been dropping, but not to the same extent as the UK. Of all the OECD countries, UK has closest to the lowest response rate in the labour force survey. Yet the labour force survey is the source of some of the most important indicators. In Australia, both the Treasury and the Central Bank take a very keen interest in labour force indicators. They are very relevant to both fiscal and monetary policy. In 2014, Australian labour force estimates were showing extreme volatility, despite very high response rates. I'm talking about response rates in the mid-90s, not around about 20%. And this volatility was causing considerable concern to those key users. I was asked to participate in a Treasury-led review. We found that the main reasons were that the labour force survey was actually being overloaded. Too many supplementary surveys. And they were actually changing the supplementary surveys. The month of the survey was conducted from one year to the next, and this can have an impact. Then they also introduced internet data collection without measuring the impact. So one important lesson we learned from that review was not to overload the labour force survey with other surveys. A recent significance article says the UK response rates have fallen from 50% to 15% in a decade, and this is common with other national statistical institutes. The statement is actually misleading. They're falling in other national statistical institutes, but not at such a fast rate and not to such a low level. If I look at the response rates from some of the other Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia is now around about 85%, down from 92% pre-COVID. Canada is about 75%, down from 87% pre-COVID. USA is about 70%, down from 82% pre-COVID. So those numbers are very much higher what's happening in the UK. And also the fall in those response rates have been in the three countries I just mentioned, have driven mainly by increased non-contact rates, not refusals. The refusal rate in Australian labour force survey is just over 3%, and that's with what is now an internet-first approach. Whereas increased refusals seem to be a big factor in the UK, and I think around about 35% of respondents when I looked at some of the data. Low response rates do not necessarily bias the estimates as long as the sample remains representative. However, the risk of a sample being unrepresentative increases dramatically as non-response rates increase. I note that the Transform Labour Force Survey includes an adaptive design strategy to improve representation. This is an excellent move, but analysis still needs to be done to ensure that the most important characteristics are well represented in the achieved sample. A few years ago, I was involved in a study of the failure of election polls in Australia for the 2019 election. The main reason for the failure was that the samples were unrepresentative, and the weighting adjustments for non-response were based on geography, age and gender, but didn't include education. And it turned out that education was one of the most important determinants of voting behaviour, and the better educated were overrepresented in the sample. So the Transform Labour Force Survey must take steps to both increase the represented of a sample, which they're trying to do with the adaptive sampling approach, and ensure that the weighting system is effective at reducing any residual non-response bias. The labour force survey is mandatory in both Australia and Canada. How does that work? In Australia, the mandatory powers exist, but they're actually rarely used in the legal sense of prosecution. You have to set your dog on an interview or doing something like that for to undertake prosecution. However, interviewers find it very helpful to be able to answer in the affirmative when asked, do I have to do this? It stresses the importance of a survey and makes the interviewer's job much easier. I should expect being able to say the survey is mandatory would also help in an internet first approach when people ask a question. Staff interacting with potential respondents are also crucial to achieving response rates. So training, establishing expectations on what's expected of them in terms of response rates, and the underlying culture are all important. Finally, I'd just like to make a few comments on the weighting system to mitigate non-response, and I share Phyllis's concerns here. In particular, good quality benchmarks are needed for a weighting system in order to significantly reduce non-response bias. I don't know enough about the accuracy of the UK benchmark data to really comment with confidence, but I know UK does not have a population register like Sweden, which uses weighting to adjust for their relatively high non-response rate, which is of the order of 40–50%. And they don't have 5-yearly censuses like Australia and Canada, which are used, among other things, to update benchmarks. So the impact of benchmark data on the uncertainty, on the uncertainty through benchmark data on labour force estimates, I think needs to be very carefully analysed in the UK. I think it probably is an area of big risk. So I'll finish there, and thanks everyone for listening.
That is some very interesting points there on low response rates. So going to move on to Paul Allen, who's RSS Honorary Officer for National Statistics and is part of Imperial College London as well.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Denise, and especially for flagging that the key issue for me as the RSS's Honorary Officer for National Statistics is to maximise the availability of trustworthy statistics that serve the public good. This concept, as you well know, underpins the 2007 legislation that established the UKSA, imports the UN's fundamental principles for official statistics, especially that, and it is worth quoting this, official statistics provide an indispensable element in the information system of a democratic society, serving the government, the economy and the public with data about the economic, demographic, social and environmental situation. This needs to be repeatedly stated to prevent any interpretation that official statistics are primarily for government. The public good is understood as both informing the public about social, economic and environmental matters and assisting in the development, delivery and evaluation of public policy by governments. As Sir Robert already noted, there are shared needs here, but some public needs may indeed will differ from those of government, for example, to hold government to account and to bring new issues to the fore. Professor Lievesley's report recognises this throughout. The government's response report is more equivocal, and we must all work to ensure that government needs do not inevitably take priority. In welcoming the recommendations and in working with the UKSA, the GSS and others in helping to implement them, the RSS will be looking to develop and take forward our vision for what we are calling public statistics, delivering statistics for the public good by, 1, starting from identifying questions that need statistics to help answer them, rather than starting from the set of available statistics. 2, acknowledging the vital role of the official statistics system in providing statistics for the public good, while 3, recognising that data to promote the public good may also need to be drawn from a much wider range of sources. We live in an increasingly data-rich world. There's a huge quantity of data available beyond official statistics. Some of this is already being used in the public good. There are great opportunities to be gained by incorporating a wider range of data into official statistics and analysis. Professor Lievesley's recommendations very much intersect with our concept of public statistics and pave the way ahead. For example, the remit of the Triennial Assembly is to determine the UK's needs for statistics, for UKSA to respond with a proposal for statistical priorities over the next 3 years. However, the reality is that pivoting the UK statistical system towards public statistics will be a long-term goal. The culture of official statistics tends to default towards government needs. Bringing non-official sources into play is seldom straightforward, as we've heard tonight. Public sector finances are tight. There are nevertheless steps to be taken in the short term, such as identifying gaps in national and local evidence needs that can be filled with statistics from non-government providers, exploring how non-government sources can best be used to meet public statistics needs. The RSS will shortly publish a paper on the concept of public statistics. We welcome discussion, debate and feedback, not only on the concept, but especially on how to put into practice our vision of more public statistics. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So we're now going to move to Aaron Chind, who is going to present online. So Aaron, whether you can unmute yourself if you're there.
Can I have can I share my screen, please?
You should be able to, I think, just by using the share option on Teams.
It's been grayed out.
Okay. We'll have our technical team work on that.
Okay, it's okay. We'll share from our end. If you just tell us when you'd like the next slide.
Okay, then in that case, yeah, please go. Yeah. 10. Okay, can you see my slides now?
Yeah, if you could start off by just giving your affiliation, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm sorry?
You just begin by giving your affiliation.
Oh, I work in many places and I work for myself through my consultancy. So, yeah, please, if you'll share my screen, that'd be helpful.
Just working on that at the moment. Just bear with us.
I'm seeing it okay.
Oh, yeah, I think I can share my screen now. They've given me the so where is it? Yeah, can you see my screen now?
Yes, yeah.
Good to go, I think. Yeah.
That's very good. So I work for myself through my own consultancy, and I would like to speak about not just the usual lies, damn lies and statistics, but also the landscape in which this happens and the distrust that official statistics tends to inspire. So
It looks like you've muted yourself, I'm being told here.
Yeah, is this better now?
Yeah. So 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So disclosure, opportunities for improvement, and I believe that there's misleading figures and flawed interpretation that I've noticed on the ONS websites, and also for opportunities for improvement due to missing information in national statistics. Unmuting myself. Okay. So next slide. Okay, so that's my, I am qualified as a physician as well as an economist as well as a statistician. And I also have the experience of being in precarious employment, and I'm forced to work for myself. So which will be of relevance when I'm talking about my own findings. So So if we look at this graphic from the Office of National Statistics website, you'll see that to the left, the people who identify themselves as white have more disability than people who identify themselves as Asian, for example. So one may be drawing the wrong conclusion that white people or Irish people or gypsies or Irish travelers are somehow disadvantaged with respect to disability. But given the nature of my job, I actually do these assessments for people who are claiming various forms of disability and seeking adjustments. And it would turn out that the people who claim disability will get more privileges, for example, in the workplace, for example, more sickness, ability to stay off work and so on. So it is wrong to say that, it's just the disability that's genuine, that disability is genuine. So I have found areas like the recommendation number 14 of making a mandatory completion of the labor force survey to be, I believe that it's going to be a futile exercise. And also the accuracy of the information is going to suffer. Because I was one of the people who was interviewed for this, and I was very embarrassed to give my information because I realized that the person doing the survey would be paid a lot less than me, for example. So number 19 also, I have an issue here. Think tanks, universities, no. I don't think they have any interest in providing public service. What's in it for them after all? So I'm going to give you a reinterpretation of the parable of the talents in leading up to the matter of inequality, which is a hot topic nowadays. So you probably know that the talents were given out there's quite a lot of inequity in how they were dished out. So the returns to the master were double each, except for the person who got the least. And I believe that this is because of the inherent inequity. In fact, the servant who was given the least, he said that, I know you're a hard man. That's why I did not invest in your money. And of relevance is that the third servant gets cast out into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And guess what? He goes into the shadow economy. So if you look into the website for the government, you'll find shadow economy mentioned only in the context of people who are fiddling the benefit system. But I find that the informal employment sector is supposed to be very low in the UK, towards the right hand side of the right lower sector of the screen. But actually, I work in the informal sector myself as a so-called self-employed person, and this is a very vulnerable employment to be in. So I've made a few comments at various sites in relation to this. And you'll find that if the Office of National Statistics goes into it, you'll find that there's a huge shadow economy, for example, in the NHS itself. So it's actually the policies of the government that create this shadow economy, if you'll go into it enough. So right now, the statistics on this are produced by, in terms of for inequality, are produced by the General Medical Council, which is the graphic that I've shown here. But actually, that's supposed to be a charity, and I don't see any reason why they have any interest in producing statistics and data for the public good, but rather to show themselves in a good light. So I had a light bulb moment when they refer to nationally employed doctors and locally employed doctors. So in summary, in the collection of data for production of official statistics, if you can say Vini, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I won, that would be great. But it's far easier to engage in self-interest and harm stakeholders by saying I came, I saw, I concurred or colluded, or errors of omission as in I Vini, Vidi, and I walked away. So clearly there's much effort that goes into the official statistics, but I believe that there's much room for improvement. So I agree with our previous speakers that the methods of data collection are very quaint and antiquated. Even in proposed coercion is not a good way of doing this. and there should be better interpretation of data, not just dishing out, bar charts. And also there's many instances of missing data, for example, the shadow economy that I've talked to you about. If anyone wants from the ONS or from government would like my assistance, I'm very pleased to help.
Great. Thank you, Arun. So now we move on to David Hand from Imperial College. I think, David, you don't have any slides. So thank you, David. Thank you.
So one of the things that Denise may not have known when she undertook this review was that when the UKSA was set up, we discussed what it should be called. Some people wanted to model it on Statistics Canada, which has got this wonderfully positive and optimistic acronym StatsCan. But we rapidly realised that Statistics United Kingdom or StatsSuck would probably not have the same pressure. Because one of the disadvantages of speaking at this stage in the proceedings is that anything you say has probably already been said. So I apologise if I'm repeating things. And I know how hard it is to produce a report covering such a complex area under time pressure. So I'd like to congratulate Denise on doing basically an excellent job. However, like the review itself, this discussion meeting is an opportunity to reflect and point out weaknesses as well as strengths. So I thought it'd be more helpful to describe something I disagreed with rather than the many more things that I agreed with. So I apologise if this is a criticism. So I'm going to jump straight in and say I was a little disappointed by the ambition of the review. And I think this seems to be a common feature of such reviews. And in my opinion, it was also true of the Bean Review of Economic Statistics, where the recommendations in large part reflected initiatives that were already in progress. As I say, because of the limitation on the length of these contributions, I'm going to restrict myself to commenting on just the first recommendation. This is that the authority should lead the establishment and delivery of a triennial statistical assembly. So I'd like you to compare two descriptions. Number one is consult widely with statistics users and producers to understand the range of views regarding the priorities and data needs for the UK. And number two is building sustainable relationships and feedback loops between statistics producers, users, and potential users of statistics and other relevant stakeholders. These are almost paraphrases of each other. The first is from recommendation 1 of the review. The second is from the terms of reference of the National Statisticians Expert User Advisory Committee. My point is that the ONS already has in place a mechanism which will achieve the aims of the Assembly and indeed will do so more effectively. Perhaps I should say could do so more effectively, as I'm going to describe. Instead of meeting just once every 3 years, as the review recommends, this committee already meets at least 4 times a year, so permitting ongoing and continuing feedback of user concerns. In contrast, the proposed assembly would at best permit an intermittent and slow provision of information on user concern. Now, I agree it may be that there is a lack of general awareness of the existence of this particular committee, but that's a matter of publicity and promotion, not of creating a suboptimal and doubtless costly attempt to replicate its work. Perhaps a triennial or better annual conference could be used to raise awareness of the existence and role of that committee, encouraging users to engage with it, so having a continuing rather than erratic benefit on user engagement. And I have to say, incidentally, the review also says the National Statisticians Expert User Advisory Committee sits across topics such as data ethics and consumer price statistics and includes representation from each of the committees. But that's not right. In fact, members of the committee are now recruited through open advertisement and include academics, RSS representatives, people from commercial operations, people from social enterprise and social research organisations, and so on. So, in summary, although I think recommendation 1 is a step in the right direction, rather than putting in place a poor variant of something that already exists, I think the authority should build on what it has, raising awareness of and accessibility to the existing mechanisms. but that any future review looks more closely at the existing structure to see if it best serves the purpose and how it might be improved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We're now going to move on to Paul Smith from University of Southampton. Paul, I think you have some slides.
I do. Remind me what to say.
Are you able to find me, or you need to find me?
Yeah, sure.
And do we have to share these?
Yeah, share the.
Let's share
Yeah,
these.
sorry.
Yeah.
It's
I think that's good, yeah. The one I failed miserably on.
Thank you. Great. Hi, Paul Smith from the University of Southampton. I too want to thank Denise for this review, which I found fascinating reading. And of course, you have to predict what everyone else is going to talk about. And I predicted, and everybody else talked about the same things. But I'm going to say some slightly different things, I hope. So I picked up the idea. I'm a methodologist as well, so I love this this recommendation. The review recommends methodological expertise on the board, and that has happened in the past in the ONS before the Stats Authority was formed. There were a couple of years just in 2000, 2001 where there was a board level methodology role, and then it kind of drifted or got sidelined or went away. So we have had some experience, and in my recollection of that period, that was a time when objectivity was quite consistently improved because of that board level role. I think methodologists are awkward people sometimes because we tend to provide constraints on solutions. So you can't do that because, but we also sometimes magic people when there's a rabbit to be pulled out. Oh yes, and if you apply this method, then we sort stuff out. So I just want to say that I think there is evidence that this has worked in the past, and therefore I agree that it should go on in the future as well. I think it will be a challenge to make it work, but I think it's really interesting. I wanted to mention also the quality of administrative data based outputs, which I think is a place where methodological expertise is really important, and where we're a little bit too focused on approaches that are based on rules. So I think there's a real need for that kind of methodological input at a high level. Denise also mentioned the idea of paying people to develop expertise. I wanted to talk just a little bit about that one as well. It's already been mentioned that one of the key things about developing expertise is that you have to be in a relatively stable position. So actually having the opportunity to do the same job over a reasonable amount of time so that you develop a set of expertise in that is really important. And that's part of the pipeline, I think, of developing those directors of methodology of the future, or even those national statisticians of the future, that we have to have all those things. It's quite noticeable, in fact, how many national statisticians, and Dennis talked about this already, have started out in methodology. We could have talked about Ivan Filagi as well, who's another methodologist who went on to be a national statistician. I think it's really important that people who are methodologists get the chance to do some research. And Stats Netherlands have been really well focused on that by having the kind of 1 day a week appointments in universities for people who are researchers. And I think that's put them in a really strong position about having people who understand the methods, but also have a chance to develop new things. All of that joins up with those international organisations and with academics, so that there are the right kinds of credentials and links for people who are working inside statistical offices. I wanted to say just a few things about where methodological input really matters at the moment. So there's a lot of focus on comparability, and Denise mentions that in the review, but I missed a little bit about a generic approach to change. So there's always this trade-off between keeping statistics the same so they're comparable over time,
and changing to something which is new, better, cheaper, whatever. But in order to do that, we need an approach to change from where we are now to where we're going. And I think that generic approach is something which is not yet there and which we need to do a bit more work with. The improved consistency, especially for those devolved topics where it's really difficult to define what a consistent approach should be like, and to take account of the devolved responsibilities at the same time, is really hard. AI and data science has grabbed a lot of attention, and I too would like to see a little bit more of that coming through into production. But I'd also like to see a little bit more about the quality of those data science outputs and methods. So I'm always wanting to see what's inside the black box and to know about the quality of those things. I think that's hard. I think the same kind of thing goes with administrative data and surveys. There's a big focus on pushing towards administrative data, but I don't think we should throw out the survey information in the places where we need it. So I'd like to have a little bit more about the quality about those trade-offs. I looked at the GSS stuff that's in the review, the support for the GSS, and I think given the focus on methodology, there could be a little bit more perhaps about how the GSS itself is supposed to get methodological support. It used to be a funded quality improvement fund, a pot of money, which enabled the GSS to buy some methodological resource and to develop methodology. That's now reduced to a very helpful methodology advisory service, but as I understand it, that's only on a repayment basis. So there isn't this little pot of money to help develop things. And I think that will be useful for the future. My other thoughts, my miscellaneous thoughts, were around making the labour force survey compulsory, which others have also talked about. My perception of how this goes is that there's been a social contract which kind of says we trust the citizens to provide some data because that helps the country to run. And I think that's currently broken, which is why response rates are down. It's not completely clear to me whether the right approach is to try to restore that contract, whether that's even possible, or whether it is to make things statutory. And I've kind of agitated on the statutory front in times recently, but maybe I can put the challenge out to you. Is there a way that we can restore that social contract in a way that people will consider that responding to all of our surveys, not just the labour force survey, as an important part of what they should do as a citizen? How would we make that work? And at that point, I'll just stop and thank Denise again for an excellent review.
Thanks, Paul. We're now going to open it up for discussions from the floor and online. So first of all, we'll start with the floor to see whether there's anybody that wants to come up and present. We've got a number of people, so we've got 1, 2. Okay, so if I maybe do in that order. So Sheila, if you can maybe come up and give your name and your affiliation, and 5 minutes. I presume you've got those slides. Okay.
Sheila Bird, formerly Medical Research Council Biostatistics Unit and honorary appointment at Edinburgh University. So I want to talk about record linkage, and most of my work on record linkage over the past goodness knows how many years has been done in Scotland. And in Scotland, we have prompt and proper registration of fact of death. Now, anytime you want to do linkage use administrative data, you need to know whether the series of events has ceased because the person has ceased, or, for example, been rehabilitated if it was something in the criminal justice system. So England, Wales and Northern Ireland do not have prompt registration of fact of death. This is extraordinary in the 21st century. And if you're going to use administrative data, you need first of all to know whether I am alive or dead today. And you can't rely upon that in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So that needs to be sorted. The second advantage that Scotland has over England is that from the mid-1995 onwards, they introduced a community health index number, which is assigned at birth. It makes sense in as so much as odd versus even tells you whether the person is male or female at birth. Date of birth is there, 3 random digits, and the sum of those digits then as a check digit. Now, to apply something like that in England, you'd need 4 random digits. But the Royal Statistical Society has floated the notion that we may need to have a discussion about having a personal identifier number, which would enable the linkage of my health data, my incarceration data, my education data, and so on. And I think that is a debate that we need to have. And I would agree with the points raised about the length of questionnaires and the design of questions in surveys. Few key questions. Remember that you are taking up somebody's time. And I think it was years ago that the Market Research Survey Organisation required reporting of response rate, so that the health survey for England that was on the Today programme, notably nothing about the response rate. And when I tracked back and asked them what it was historically, it had dropped to 7% currently. Do ministers really make decisions about the public health on 7% response surveys? Now, if you don't know that, you expect that it's a decent effort. It's not. Thank you.
And Sheila? So now I'm going to move on to Simon Briscoe. So to you, Simon, 5 minutes, please. And I should be remiss to say that all these will be written up. Anybody who wants to contribute will be written up and will be provided as part of the paper. So to you, Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Simon Briscoe. I was a government statistician for a few years and then an active user of government data for many years, and then a one-time advisor to PASC and PACAC up until 2019. I also welcome this review. It was much needed, and it was actually a request of the final PACAC report in 2019 that such a review takes place. Problem is that I feel the governance of the system has failed rather more dramatically than the report indicates. For me, the ultimate route of accountability is via Parliament, and that's currently PACAC. And over a few years of reports up to 2019, various recommendations were produced, and I reckon about 200 of those have yet to be addressed in the official response from government. I do wish the review had actually looked at that responsiveness of the system to parliamentary suggestions. On the topic of inflation, and I'll come back to this in a moment in a bit more depth, UXA also ignored the intent of other parliamentary committees. UXA now staffs, I repeat that, UXA now staffs the parliamentary committee that is supposed to be scrutinising it. So the role I once had is now occupied by UXA staff. This is a very good way of ensuring no tricky questions are ever asked of officials, and I just don't believe this is good practice that should continue. Governance on inflation used to work okay, I think, in a sense. I mean, when we were all young, there was an RPI advisory committee, and this had wide societal representation. There were public sessions, topics and conclusions in the public domain. Parliamentary reports were published, methodological changes were set out. But there's been a bit of a slip since then. And it started with Gordon Brown, who sought to seize control. The Treasury ran with it. The Statistics Act of 2007, I think, cemented the political control on the RPI, and I think UXA duly fell into line. There were then some professional failings with inflation in 2011 that led to issues with the calculation of RPI. Now, UXA failed to tackle the actual problems with the RPI. It just said the RPI should not be used. It's also continues to fail to tackle the problems with the CPI, which has weaknesses. Anyone who looks at the detail of the CPI will be able to find examples, whether it's in their water bills or the rents figures or quality adjustments on laptops and phones and so forth. Can't go into that today, but would love to another time. Where are these topics discussed? Nowhere, as far as I can tell. And this matters because I think this policy of telling everyone to ignore the RPI and use a CPI which is not properly looked at is actually harming people's lives. Events of the last 15 years have led to more users, largely at the Treasury behest, to move from using the RPI to the CPI for up ratings. And this matters because the CPI rate is generally lower than the RPI rate. And that shift from RPI to CPI for up ratings has led to a loss in the last decade of about 20% of increase in benefits and pensions for those who depend on these things. So that means the incomes of the poorest in our society are roughly 20% lower than they would be had these mistakes not occurred and had governance been somewhat different. When you do next read articles about the root cause of poverty, do imagine what an additional 20% what difference that would make to these very poorest. Now these failures reflect weak governance. So just to run through a few, the existing inflation committees are not open to the public. I don't think they're transparent. The OSR does lots of good work, but largely and oddly, and I think uniquely on this topic, it just doesn't touch inflation. Rarely, and I don't think properly, is inflation ever discussed at UXA boards. There's too much reliance on unaccountable, I would call, internal review, which was the Paul Johnson review about a decade ago. User engagement is minimal, Parliament's largely ignored. Pressure from key users such as the OBR and the Bank of England is unclear, it's sort of hidden from sight. Denise, as she said, had to ignore these figures in her review because she was told to do so. So it's nothing to blame Denise here. So I think there's a broad-based failure of the system here. And, the news has been full in the last few days of issues to do with Horizon, the postmasters, infected blood and so forth. This sort of the system-wide failure. And I do wonder whether at some stage people might look at government data in the same way. So to conclude, I hope that UXA will feel that it needs to deal with this problem. It needs to be genuinely transparent and open to users. I doubt it will, though, because there's really no pressure for it to do so. The government structures have largely failed. And this review might make some changes, but I think it's a matter of might. My final thought, I do wonder whether it was perhaps not poor drafting by the Cabinet Office in the review remit to focus on the needs of government. Perhaps government does want to have its influence on some of these numbers. It's a very good reason why government would want the very lowest possible inflation number, and that's certainly what the system has delivered. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I had one more person in the room. Yeah. If you get it, give your name and affiliation. Thank you. And 5 minutes, please.
Hi, I'm Anna Powell-Smith. I run the Centre for Public Data. We are a non-profit organisation and we work for stronger data and stats to support civil society. Thank you, Denise. It's a brilliant review. We were very happy to see the focus on data gaps, on user needs, and the focus on wider user groups, including media, including civil society, often not included in these things. We work with these users, we see the effect data gaps have on their advocacy and campaigning, and we see the questions that can't be answered from official stats, like who owns the UK's land, or how many people appearing in court don't have a lawyer. These are things official statistics don't answer currently in this country. We do have one concern, which is about the assembly. I think there's a risk if it's conceived of as a single event. The risk is it could exclude people who don't have the time and the money to attend, which will include probably journalists and many charities and the large ones. And also it's difficult to run such events representatively. The loudest voices tend to get heard and the quieter ones don't. So Robert says there are no off-the-shelf solutions. Disagree. When it comes to gathering user needs, there are solutions that are well known. User needs mapping, user research is a kind of well-known discipline. You identify registered users, you interview them, use those techniques. They're not expensive, relatively speaking. Yeah, that's the only point, really. I mean, the question of how you then balance those needs is a much harder job that I don't envy. But yeah, we'd urge the Assembly is not a single event, but a series of different techniques.
So is there anybody else on the floor that would like to contribute? Alison? Yeah, would you like to go? Yeah, and if you give just your name and affiliation, and if we could keep it to 5 minutes. Thank you.
I think my name's Alison McFarlane, retired statistician or very partial at City University of London, shortly to become City St George's University of London. I really, I think most of the points I would wanted to make have been made. I just wanted to point out something that where we're looking for areas where a bit of extra investment might be useful, to point out that at the data gathering stage, Denise pointed out that these reviews are usually looking for efficiencies of 5%. The AXA had already absorbed, quotes, efficiencies of 10%. I think being old enough to remember the Thatcher era, where efficiencies were a euphemism for cuts, so the opportunity to make cases where some of the deficiencies Denise has identified could be addressed, that we're looking at a situation where there has been a 10% cut, and those of us who work with ONS can see some of the things that's happening there. And so to just to make the case that's that obviously not part of this review, but a wider public thing, such as the value of statistics, that improvements need to be done with reduced funds rather than any additional investment. Thank you.
I don't think we have anybody online who's looking to contribute that hasn't contributed already. So one last call for anybody from the floor that would like to contribute. No? In which case, I'm going to hand it back over to Denise. I think Denise is going to not respond formally to any of the questions, but I'll give you a chance to speak, Denise.
Well, I want to thank everybody. That was really helpful, and both positive and negative comments are really helpful and very, very constructive for us to think about, not just future reviews, but also the implementation. And I know that Sir Robert has been listening carefully too. So thank you for those, for the opportunity to listen and to respond to you. The RSS has a wonderful system whereby you write down what you've said and maybe other written contributions, and then I'm going to respond to them in writing. So I take the opportunity to do that. I don't think I need to react at the moment, and I think it would be inappropriate to do so. But I'm very, very excited to hear the positive comments, and I will listen to the ones that were not so positive and react to them. And thank you all very much. And may I repeat my thanks to the RSS for organising this meeting, but also for the engagement over the implementation plan and the triennial assembly, which I hope won't be a one-off. So respond to one point. Thank you.
So thank you to Denise for the paper. I mean, I think this is really a great topic for discussion meeting. We've had a really lively and engaging discussion. So thank you to all the formal discussants. Thank you for all the other people that did an informal discussion. We have one written set of comments that we'll add in as well. Denise, as she said, will respond formally, and it will be partly documented. I'd also like to thank the HQ staff for keeping it all running. Not trivial, I know. So thank you so much for the guys at the back there for sorting out all those online as well for sticking with it. And so thank you very much for that. For those that are here, we've got a sort of drinks reception upstairs. Everybody's welcome to attend. So I hope you've got a chance to again raise any more questions that you have and enjoy that post COVID. Next discussion meeting is on the 3rd of June. That is online only. Further details of upcoming discussion meetings are available on the RSS website. So again, thank you very much, and enjoy a few glasses of wine.